Hi, everyone, and good morning, afternoon, or evening as it may be. Welcome to the November 8th meeting of Gateway API's Gamma working group. As always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect, so please treat each other respectfully. And with that, let's get on to the meeting. It is an open agenda, so the meeting notes doc should be linked in the meeting invite. Anyone feel free to add a topic that you're interested in talking about. And also please add your name to the list of attendees so we can keep a good idea of who is showing up and participating in these. I will share my screen. All right, so we can start off with a brief recap of last week's meeting. 2 weeks ago, we did not have a meeting due to KubeCon, but it was great to get a chance to meet a bunch of folks in person there. So, and there was a couple of definitely worthwhile talks checking out. There seemed to be a lot of interest and excitement about Gateway API overall. And yeah, I just wanted to specifically call out the admin network policy talk and the Linkerd auth-z talk as both being potentially relevant to kind of future direction of Gamma auth-z things. I don't think that the videos are up yet, but I believe they should be on those talk links eventually when they get there. And yeah, we also had some good discussions with SIG multi-cluster folks. They're kind of looking for the next wave of projects past the current MCS API work. So that may be an avenue to collaborate on for things as we start looking at like off-cluster, multi-cluster, and other such concerns. So that's another thing to keep an eye on for the future. Other notes from last meeting, Nick has a document which he's currently looking for feedback on policy attachments and meta resources, kind of clarifying some of the existing patterns that we have really. Basically, policy attachments as one kind of meta resource. So if you have bandwidth, please take a look through there. It will eventually become a GEP, but early feedback is definitely appreciated. We made some progress on figuring out what to do for conformance testing. It sounds like Istio has a testing utility echo server thing that we'll plan to kind of extract out from there, and hopefully they'll be able to donate it to kubesigs. And that should let us get a foothold on some of the utility work, the boilerplate stuff for starting to write some meaningful Gamma conformance tests without spending too much time reinventing the wheel on that kind of stuff. And we have a milestone for tracking implementation readiness for Gamma. There's a handful of tasks in there that basically came out of comment threads in the original GEP that I was working on that has now been merged. So that is kind of like where we're tracking next steps for like officially marketing this as, hey, please start implementing it. And I'll pull up the last thing because that was discussed, that Keith added, because that was discussed last night in Gateway API upstream. So while working on through initial implementation, John found that the parent reference sets gateway.networking.case.io as the default group instead of the core API group. So I have an open PR addressing this. It's basically, we discussed upstream and it sounds like this is not ideal. So the way to get around it to specify services parent ref is you will have to explicitly set the empty string as the group. It's not ideal. We agreed that it should not be a blocker for alpha, but is definitely something to take a closer look at as a blocker for beta. And we also want to kind of escalate it up to, I think it was the SIG API machinery group, to try to like see if other people are having similar weird UX issues with this. So we have a short-term solution that is hopefully workable, and longer term, we know that we want to find a way to make this better. Whew. All right. So does anyone have questions or anything else that we want to bring up as far as this before we move into kind of two of the larger topics of this meeting? All right. I added this multi-cluster mesh. I saw that Shane started a discussion. I'm going to bump that down because I expect it might take up a potentially large amount of time.
Hey,
surely not.
But Flynn, if you
how
want
rude.
to start off on, you had some feedback that you wanted to share on restrictions in the GEP that was merged. Yeah.
So first off, my apologies for the delay on that one. The Linkerd folks were at KubeCon, and then we had a company all hands after that. So things have been a little strange the last couple of weeks. But we did, in fact, get together with some of the Linkerd maintainers and go over 1426 with a relatively fine-tooth comb. And Mate will keep me honest here because he's on the call as well. But I think the summary is that everything in there seems implementable, with the exception that some of the restrictions in it are actually going to make things harder for us to implement. Specifically, the constraint that you can only have one HTTP route rather than following the existing gateway API stuff, and the restriction about services and their routes being in the same namespace. We were kind of curious if there's maybe an easy way to turn those into mays rather than musts or something like that.
What was the second one? A services? What?
Restricting services and their routes to having to be in the same namespace. But John, you had your hand raised like
so I was going to say
2 sentences in there. So go ahead.
I actually totally agree with you. I think I want to say all of them, but I don't know. I'd have to go check. I think every restriction in there I wanted to lift as well. And I just wanted to get it merged first. So then I sent follow-ups removing a lot of them. I haven't got to all of them. Some have open PRs because there's things to work out, but I totally agree with you. The one about namespaces, I think is tricky. I generally agree with you, but let me link the PR here actually, and I would love to get some discussion, if not on this call, on the PR. But yeah, I generally agree with you. Like I think those were kind of temporary.
It was pretty clear that they were intended as temporary. I wanted to bring it up mostly just in the sense of it felt like the sort of thing that we might want to actually try to rephrase as, yeah, if you have an implementation that this will make easier, go for it. But if you have some existing thing where you want to relax these, then go for that too. That was kind of where I was going on that.
Yeah, I generally agree. My only concern would be if we just leave things unspecified, then we'll go do different things. So I would prefer if we just specify them ASAP, and then we're all on the same page on how they should work. Because like if we just say like, you can do cross namespace stuff, like, well, what does that mean, right?
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll come up with different meanings for it. So
yeah, and I completely with you on that one. Yeah. The specific thing, and I'll go, we'll comment on the PR, but the specific thing with namespaces is that in Linkerd land, there are things that we want to add where actually things that we already have in place for some of this stuff, where the provider of a service should be able to specify a particular set of policy, but the consumer might actually want to also specify a more restrictive policy. Like the provider might say something like, oh, it's okay if you do a 10-second timeout. And then the consumer really should be able to say things like, actually, no, I want to use a 2-second timeout because that's the way my client, that's the way I roll. And being able to specify those with things with a route in the provider's namespace and also a route in the consumer's namespace turns out to work really well for us. But thank you for the PR. I will go take a look at that afterwards, and off we go.
Yeah, I'd recommend everyone take a look because it's it's a tricky one.
It's getting bigger. I think that like logically it makes a lot of sense, but it definitely like increases the scope from just the initial gap was really largely focused on like producer service owner defined rules, and John's PR expands it to focus on it also include client defined routing behavior.
Yep. And I should also point out that Mike, I think the scope of 1426 was pretty much spot on. I think that was, that was what needed to be put down so that we could move forward with it. I think it was a great plan. But yeah, it was very interesting to sit down and really start digging into it with some of the maintainers and kind of go like, ooh, yeah, we're gonna get ourselves into trouble if we try to follow this exactly. So.
I think that we would probably have similar concerns. We just haven't gotten to that step of implementation yet. So yeah, definitely appreciate the folks that are starting to take a look at like what it's going to take to implement this. This kind of feedback's great, and definitely it was written with like what's the most conservative small thing that we can get in, and then at what is safe to remove.
In general, there's stuff going on in Linkerd right now where using language from Gamma, a lot of Linkerd's history is focused on being able to set policy and take action at the provider's side of what happens with the proxy. And unsurprisingly, people want to be able to take action at the consumer side as well. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in Linkerd right now that focuses around, okay, how do we separate these two? How do we make it possible for people to configure and still be able to explain it, that sort of thing. So a lot of that was very much top of mind going into this, and I expect will keep coming up in this meeting over the next little while.
Yeah, I think that's great because it sounds like SDO has very similar concerns. So having at least like two significant implementations that may have like different implementation details and concerns, both working on this problem, I think will hopefully get us to a good place where it should be broadly implementable. So yeah, definitely appreciate y'all taking a close look at it.
I would hope the same thing. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, one thing I would say, and I think I've said this over and over again, but it's worth repeating. I think where we want to be in the project right now is that folks are going and taking the spec and either giving it a really close look or actually implementing it, but not becoming attached to it. Because once people implement it, they will find issues with it that we didn't find when we talked about it. It happens every time. Yes. So do implement it or some version of it or look at it closely, but don't get attached because you or someone else will certainly find an issue and we'll have to change it. So we're kind of in the time period where all hands on, all in on it, but be willing to back off, right?
Iteration expected. And that was all I had. So I guess we can go talk multi-cluster stuff, which I'm sure will be a nice.
I'm not even sure I meant to put that on this agenda, but
I put it on there for you.
But in retrospect, nobody responded to the discussion, so I guess we should probably talk about it a little bit. I was kind of hoping for a show of hands, which it seemed like there were plenty of thumbs up, so I take that as kind of a show of hands that people care about this, being able to potentially to express this in terms of Gateway API, or rather APIs within Gateway API. But the idea that you could have a mesh that would go across multiple clusters, I'm representing Kuma,
Linkerd already supports this.
Yeah, I'm aware of a few that do. So one thing I'm stuck on is, how that looks in the future, like some kind of like what the semantics are for that. And in Kuma, we are interested. Actually, we're interested in having a mesh resource. Full disclosure, we are interested in having a mesh resource, and we would be interested in being able to somehow attach to or decorate that mesh resource in a way that you could say, this needs to be a part of this mesh, which goes across clusters. And curious if anybody had given this any thought. If you all kind of want something similar.
So I'm curious why, actually, let me phrase that differently. Is the reason you want a mesh resource for multi-cluster, or are there other reasons? Or
reasons.
Are there also other reasons?
There are other reasons. We already have a mesh resource, and one of the things that we're looking at potentially wanting to do, which plays in with what Gateway API has already provided for Ingress, is using a mesh resource potentially in Gateway that you can then post and then receive an actual deployment of a mesh. It doesn't have the same impact as Gateway, because in Gateway, you may want to create multiple gateways, and in mesh, creating multiple meshes is something that I think we'll have to deal with in time, but it doesn't have the same, there's not as much of that in mesh land. You're not going to have as many clusters with multiple meshes deployed on them. That said, the way we're headed right now, we're kind of almost avoiding multiple mesh with some of the direction that we're headed with like the prototypical stuff that we even just talked about, like the HTTP route stuff. And I think that probably isn't something that we should do. I think we should basically try to create isolation around meshes instead of having it be like HTTP route attaches to a service. Every mesh is going to now, pick up on that and implement it. I really like the semantics of saying this needs to be attached to this. This mesh needs to serve this. Something semantically there, and then it that's like totally overloading the original point. But also, when you want to have a mesh join another mesh in another cluster, the mesh resource be at the center of that. Say something like, here's an attachment to a mesh in another Kubernetes cluster, or something like that. Attachment might not be the right word. I'm sure I'll say the word that everybody hates over and over again: join, attach. Everybody will hate every word, but that's the idea.
If
anyway.
if it makes you feel any better, the verb Linkerd uses, I think, is link, which is probably perhaps worse.
Let's go with link. Let's just go with it though. So link to that other mesh, right? Is this something other people want?
So the reason I didn't respond to the discussion yet is because I wasn't quite sure how to concisely express something that could easily be an entire document.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of like prior art in the space of like folks that have tried previous variations of multi-cluster things, including like from our perspective, console has supported multiple clusters within a single console deployment in one way, and now we're exploring a different path forward for that. I think like KubeFed is like another example of a specific model that was tried for something.
Yeah, I worked on that.
And
kind of awful.
Yep. It is now archived, I think, for some similar reasons of kind of like mixing concerns.
Prior art does not necessarily mean good prior art. Let's just
yeah, exactly.
Table,
so like yeah, there's prior art that has like highlighted problems and difficulties and some of the like conflating concerns together that maybe should be handled a little more separately. So that's why I definitely have like thoughts on like the word join versus like trying to focus the conversation around like articulating the specific like what is the like minimum objective of the thing of like I want to be able to direct traffic from this domain name through a gateway to a service in another cluster.
That's another interesting point. if semantically you actually have a gateway in your multi-cluster mesh topology,
is this
not something that is necessary in Kuma. There's actually a separate semantic for having a gateway between service meshes that connects them.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking as the ingress, exterior to that part. But yeah.
Okay,
so like
I was going to ask if this is a gateway in general, or if this is a gateway API gateway, or some more specific use of the term. Sounds like you're just talking about a generic portal that allows traffic to pass between clusters here.
Yeah, I am not gotten into those details yet. I think like this is why we need to like have this conversation in more specific terms of like what are the concrete topologies and like user stories that we want to enable
Maybe
here.
not. Maybe not. Bear with me. Bear with me for a
Okay.
second. Maybe we back it. Maybe we back this up, and you guys can get on the discussion and write the diatribe that you want to write about multi-cluster mesh. But maybe
Please, rants, not diatribes.
I didn't mean that in a negative way, but then I realized just after I said it, diatribe has a negative connotation. So I do apologize for that. I didn't mean that in a negative way.
No apology needed.
Okay. So I'm going to let Keith go, but just let me finish my thought. Maybe we back this up just a little bit. I'm thinking about for Kuma, how to even semantically start thinking about these kinds of operations on mesh, right? Operations with mesh, like creating a mesh, attaching, joining, peering, linking a mesh to another mesh somewhere. Like these things semantically are starting to become important to us as we're starting to think about like a mesh operator. And we would like Gamma, Gateway API, to kind of be at the center of that with something that we wouldn't have our own version of it, but rather other people, like anybody who understands Gateway API would know how to talk this, like these operations in mesh. Does that resonate with anyone else?
Yes.
You get into some entertaining questions on conformance with those too. So yeah, that definitely resonates.
Yeah, maybe I can give an example how we have a POC today on AWS. So we use gateway, you can interpret gateway as a mesh. So you define a gateway or define a mesh object if we have a mesh object available. The next thing what we do is on each cluster, you specify, the HTTP route. You just say you want to attach to which gateway. So gateway or mesh is span multiple cluster, which means there's no Kubernetes cluster boundary. Really, every HTTP route, every pod can see all the HTTP route within the mesh. But you cannot access, the only way you can access is through policies. Just like, anything on the AWS, you can see S3 bucket, but you won't be able to see each other's bucket, read and write. So that's how we treat it. So you can define multiple cluster attached to the same gateway. The gateway, if you're coming from open source, back in the day, open source, people have distributed L2 switches. We treat it like gateway, like distributed gateway. It's like everywhere. That's one use case.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely, it sounds similar to some things that I've been thinking about. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that.
I think Daniel's question in chat is interesting. Are we still talking about multi-cluster or an install mechanism? And the problem here is, or a problem here is that, yeah, some of those operations blur that distinction in some ways because the multi-cluster thing might be another operation. But I also think that Keith has been waiting very patiently, and yes, perhaps Keith should talk. Or maybe he's been waiting impatiently but quietly. I don't really know.
No, it's good. I think we have kind of, initially multi-cluster and mesh enablement and install mechanisms were explicitly cut from scope from what Gamma was trying to do when we did I forget the gap number, but our first gap that we did with our goals and things of that nature didn't have anything to do with multi-cluster. I think one thing at the top of my mind is, we start talking about installing a mesh or adding another cluster to a mesh, we start blurring a line, I think, between where Gateway API is, I think for the most part, talking about routing and such. And I don't know how I feel yet about that being a part of Gateway, about that being a part of Gamma.
I get that. I would just point out that it is a gateway API thing, like to say create a gateway and actually get a gateway. That's very common on the non-mesh side.
Create a gateway and get a gateway, or because like do you install the Kuma like gateway or the contour control, not Kuma, but the con control plane or like the contour control plane and the envoys when you create a gateway resource?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And
For
then
some reason, I always,
GCP will like create a load balancer for you if you create a gateway underneath the hood. So that's outside the cluster, but same concept. So the operational component of Gateway API is an intentional one. The intention that the resource like Gateway is for operators to like set up the things that then under the hood, the developers or people that aren't operators ultimately are then setting up the routes to. That is an intentional distinction. One that I would like to see in the mesh side of things.
yeah, I need to do more thinking about that because my understanding was that the gateway resource would only create a load balancer, and the gateway class was installed whenever you did a separate Helm install Kong, Helm install Contour. I always thought those were two separate things, so I need to double check my understanding on that. But to kind of go back to the multi-cluster piece, I think I tend to agree with what others are saying in chat, where like installing the control plane should not be a part of the spec. But to go to the multi-cluster conversation, I do want to echo what Mike has said earlier, that we need to be very specific about what these operations are, because as we've seen, it can turn very quickly into, oh, I want to make this, I want to use multi-cluster for mesh. Well, now that can possibly like bleed into installing a mesh on a cluster, which I don't think is a part of the original scope. And it seems dubious that,
I'm not
that
sure
we
why
even want that agent wave.
Sounds like you
I'm not
think
sure it
if
needs
somebody
to
else
bleed
talk, go
into
ahead.
that. So, sorry.
Yeah,
I
I'm
don't-
actually okay with
no.
the idea that it doesn't need to bleed into that. It almost sounds like at least the first reaction is we probably don't have a general way. Basically, Gateway API is trying to find the union of like programming these things, right? Like describing these things between all implementations. If every implementation in this room is like, I don't really feel like I could describe that in the same way as you, then we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Go ahead, Flynn.
If we think in terms of operations, then requiring a Gamma implementation to be able to install the control plane of a mesh feels not so much in scope to me, whether we're talking about in one cluster or another cluster or whatever. This is actually one of my, no offense, Shane, this is one of my big annoyances about the Gateway API in general, because it makes it trickier to be conformant to Gateway API for an ingress unless you do a fair amount of work that you might not want to do about installing things. On the other hand,
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
On the other hand, the operation of, if you have cluster A and cluster B and you know that both of them are running, already have a control plane installed, the operation of linking those two together into a multi-cluster thing feels like something that could be in scope. Maybe not today, but that does not feel misscoped to me. That feels like an operation that makes sense in a fair amount of ways. I'm sorry, Shane, what were you about to say?
No, I was just going to add that I hear you on the whole bit about it being like you don't necessarily like the whole idea that we're kind of pushing like an operator focus with the gateway resource. I would just go on to say that even at Kong, we actually have 4 implementations of Gateway API, and one of them doesn't do that, but still is conformant. So like the option to have a reflective gateway reset, the option to have a gateway resource, but there's not an operator creating the gateway, but still ultimately being conformant is a thing that exists. But it was not the most painless thing to try to make that work given gateway semantics.
Yeah, so exactly.
I'm with you on that.
And also, I mean, I understand that was a decision, that was a design decision that was made. That was not an accident. And so, okay, I appreciate that. But yeah.
If you can make it work, it's like, I think it's really glorious for the end users. Like, I mean, at the end, it's hard for us implementers, but that's kind of part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to like,
I'm okay with making lives hard on ourselves to make it easier for the users. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Right. Roger that. Anyway, thanks for hearing me out on that. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to pop back
Go
in
ahead.
and say, because I realized I missed a use case in the conversation as it branched out. But the idea of connecting, or maybe this got talked about and I missed it. But the idea of connecting two clusters together within the same mesh, I'm intrigued by the possibility of that, because I think that may have been the original question in the GitHub discussions. And I believe we talked about a little bit here at the beginning, and having a mesh resource be the center point of that. In my experience, with OSM, we're working on an MCS API, and most MCS controllers, whether it's your cloud provider or Submariner or Karmata, there's typically like an imperative step that needs to happen in order to do a join. Maybe there's secrets being exchanged between the two clusters, and that experience feels like it could be smoother. I don't believe that should be the sole justification for adding a mesh resource to Gateway API. It's my opinion. So go ahead.
It should not. I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, should not. Yeah, my opinion is not the sole justification. I think that their routing should stay the main justification for APIs and Gateway API. But I do think that I agree with the point that you made earlier, Shane, that there's just something semantically crisper about having a HTTP route be bound to this service within a particular mesh. I think that feels clean. We didn't go that direction initially due to a couple of concerns. One being the need to possibly change things in the HTTP route resource, which was, we wanted to have a strong reason why we need to do that before we went down that path. I don't yet feel like that bar is met. That's a lot of words to say that I'm intrigued by the idea, and it might be a strong supporting argument, but I personally probably want to see more on the routing use case before going too far down that road.
Sounds good. Go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say, like, it's tough because I think this whole like connecting multiple clusters thing is a real problem that a lot of things have, not just mesh, right? But I would caution that I think it's a very hard problem. That is the type of thing that it's like getting consensus, not just with people in this group, but then also like all the multi-cluster efforts potentially in Kubernetes, which is just like a massive uphill battle. So I'm not saying don't work on this, just giving a word of caution.
Yeah, fair. I think it's a hard problem to solve, to implement. But I'm becoming more and more convinced, and as I'm focused more on the operational side of mesh and like how that relates to Gamma and Gateway API, and why I'm even talking about this stuff, like how operations would work with potentially an API that all of us implement, it seems like the workflow of like Jane the developer or Jane the operator, Flynn will like that, deploys a mesh.
It's usually Jane the developer and Julian the operator, just to
Thank you.
Totally mess with
Jane the developer, we'll start with Julia the operator, deploys a mesh onto her Kubernetes cluster on these namespaces. That is something semantically I think all of us can do, and like that's easily describable in human words. Maybe that's something that we should be able to describe in Gamma APIs. And then additionally, once you have a mesh, and that is a thing for Julia the operator, potentially, like that semantically makes sense to Julia the operator. I have a Kuma mesh and I have an Istio mesh and I have a so on and so forth. Be able to say, I need to attach this mesh to one in another cluster. I think semantically, that could be made very simple to describe. The implementation is potentially horrendous, but but the basic description, the union where every mesh can do this, or most meshes can do this, maybe it would be extended, I think it's there. I think we could probably very easily describe that in a way that everybody could do it. The difficulty would just be the implementation, and that's what we're afraid of, I guess, right now.
So I think from our perspective, it's not just implementation, it's really like what assumptions are going along with that, like join or connect kind of thing. So like there are ways to do this where they share config, like sync config or state across clusters. Cupid and Console have both discovered that to be a somewhat problematic assumption. Some projects like MCS API have like very explicit statements around like what equivalencies are expected across clusters and how those should be enforced. You also end up with like do you have a single primary cluster where stuff is applied, and then like dependent or secondary clusters versus like two independent clusters that expose services to each other through some other connection method. So there's a lot going on there that I think really needs to be articulated a bit better in terms of like what is the actual, not just the implementation details, but like what are the base assumptions between these clusters.
Shane, did the stuff that I typed in there accurately capture what you were trying to convey?
Yeah,
cool.
It's about this separation so that Jane and Julian do not have to worry about this from implementation to implementation. Julian is used to the idea of I have Kuma, I've deployed a mesh, I've linked it to a did I say Kuma elsewhere. Like I think I understood what Mike just said. To me it's maybe just let me rephrase what I heard, Mike, just so that you're concerned that, okay, we can describe that in English, something that works between different implementations. And I suggested that it means it's mostly just an implementation details problem, right? You're suggesting that no, there's no way for all of these implementations to fully automate from a basic, like a general, like from the union of instructions. We can't all fully automate that because there's too many complexities and too many differences in implementations. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so there's actually like a good Linkerd blog post that describes like at a very high level some of these like what are the assumptions around multi-cluster topologies and what are the various options you have for them. And those do have implications for like, should services be able to connect, should a pod be able to connect to another pod in a different cluster directly or through a gateway? And like, how are something like producer defined rules for like an HTTP route or policy applied across clusters or can they not be? So you end up with some of your like base assumptions have implications for implementation details. I've seen Daniel has his hand raised for quite a while, so I want to make sure that he gets a chance to speak.
Go for it.
Hey, Mike, well, if you can find the blog post you're talking about,
Yes.
I'm looking at one that I'm not sure is the right one, so I don't want to post it.
Yeah, I'll like it.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is just, and I put this in chat already. Maybe that's a different approach altogether. So I don't know if this mesh resource that we're talking about and spanning like multiple clusters, I also think that it's too much tied to the implementation of the mesh vendor, as I don't see how we could really standardize on that really. And for me also the more interesting part of when I think of a mesh resource is not so much sort of the inner workings and how I extend a mesh across clusters, but rather I would look at the edge and have a resource that informs other services or potentially services in another mesh instance. You know, how do I talk to this service? And that's why in the chat I said I'd prefer something like a trust domain resource, because from what I can tell, what really is one of the defining features of service meshes is the encryption, right? And the encryption context. So you need to know a few bits in order to talk to a service that is in a service mesh, right? You might have to go through a specific gateway. You might have to trust a specific certificate or root certificate. And that's sort of that's something that I would see as maybe interesting for Gateway API to establish these sorts of interactions between different vendors. Because I'm not sure if standardizing on things like, how do we span or mesh across multiple clusters, it's not really, as you said, Mike, there's a lot of implementations and it hasn't really standardized around one or two concepts. So I think it's hard to come up with an API that properly explains this or describes it.
I'm with you. I think the more we've talked about it in here, the more I'm being convinced that we probably all can't find that union of describing linking, peering, joining, smashing together meshes in different clusters. But I'm becoming more convinced, just from having thought about it more and talking about it here, that being able to find the union of like working on the operational side of things is something that I'd like to see happen in Gamma. Keith, I'd like to specifically ask you about this because you seemed, I think what I got from most people, I think in this conversation so far, most people were like, maybe we could talk about like doing ops kind of stuff. I think I got from Flynn that it's like I really don't want to be forced to do it. And then I think I got from John that it was like show me what it looks like. But you specifically seem to be like, if I'm not misinterpreting what you said, like you really would not like to do that. You really don't want to have to deal with ops in this API, something that you can like, that users can bring from mesh to mesh. And like, I know how to do these operations because they all implement Gamma and so they all do these operations with the same API. Is that accurate? Did I miss? You're muted, just so you know.
Yeah, I wasn't saying anything. I was just thinking. I think for me, it's not as strong as I don't want to, but I've got a pretty big hesitation towards doing ops in the API. Because I mean, part of it comes from my SMI experience and the experience trying to kind of codify traffic metrics. Yeah, so we tried to do traffic metrics, which was somewhat opsy, standardize how metrics would come across for people to consume. And it also is one of those situations where it's very difficult to get people to standardize on one set of things. And most of the hesitation, I guess, comes from kind of my vision for service mesh technology long term and how I see customers wanting service meshes to be usable. And the short version of that is I think there's still a ways to go on some of that. And I'm wary of attempting to standardize too early because I don't think we've seen the end of operations for service mesh. And I worry that too much standardization right now could impede innovation. I love to see people still try to make the experience simpler. But the, multi-cluster, being one example, I agree it's an imperative process. I would love to see a declarative way of doing that. But at this juncture, with how young Gamma is relatively, and with the variety of ways that there are to join a mesh, I think that Istio's ambience, I think that's still somewhat of an open question. Lynn or John or someone can correct me and tell me I'm wrong. But yeah, I don't feel. It's not that I don't feel the need yet. I think I rather feel like the community might be better served by enduring the pain a bit longer so that pain might produce more innovation. I don't know. That's very future looking, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. Like, I don't want to block this if we have sufficient, if enough people feel like that's something they want to work on, that we need it now. But yeah, that's kind of my POV on it.
I appreciate that POV on it. It gives me something to think about. I mean, it sounds like the TLDR on that is like basically just hard focus on the developer experience today. Period. Like, because we have limited time, we want to get something that works and we need to have that forward momentum. I'm coming from a perspective slightly different where it's like, I'm a little worried that if we put too much momentum in that direction, we will miss the opportunities for something that we have in Gateway API today. Like, one thing that's a little, I don't know, maybe it's not odd, but just, did anybody have their hand up, by the way? I don't want to take the mic too long. It's just one thing that's kind of interesting is like seeing Kuma deployed and then ultimately seeing us create a gateway. So Kubernetes has an API gateway that we can create to create an ingress gateway. It'll create an Envoy proxy. It'll come up and then it'll allow you to get ingress traffic into the mesh, but not have anything similar for like the mesh to do those kinds of ops on the mesh, like just for the gate, just for that one piece, right? You can do that kind of like have an API that describes like operational things that you want to have done to supplement the mesh. And so it's not the end of the world or anything, but that's today. And it just, I'd love for users to be in a place tomorrow where, you know, I have gone from all these different, I have tried all the different implementations of mesh. Let's just say, you know, Istio and Kuma, and, you know, let's just go with that for now, just because that's what's in my head. But like, I've tried both of these, and at least to get started and to like do the basics, it works the exact same way for me. That's the promise of Kubernetes, right? That's what the Kubernetes API is trying to promise at the end of the day, is that you don't have to learn. You'll eventually have to learn it. As you dig deep, you'll always have to get into the nitty gritty. There will always be a gateway configuration that you'll have to potentially plant on top of a gateway resource that's only for this type of thing. And you get into like CRDs, but the general starting out experience that we can all do the same thing everywhere we go with like different implementations of the same thing, I'd like to see us not miss that and end up so deep in kind of the momentum that we've started that we miss out on those opportunities. Does that make sense? Did I say that right?
I think that's a really good point. And it's one that I absolutely sympathize with. You know, I think that these points in time in the history and evolution of software are very important. And like, I think this is absolutely the appropriate time to be figuring out, okay, what are we going to miss if we don't have this conversation right now? You know, for all of its, I guess, struggles, you know, SMI, one of the things I think was good about SMI is that it was a mesh spec. It was marketed as such. That was the charter. It was going to be a specification, an interface for service meshes. Where part of my hesitation for doing this in Gamma is that it is simply a gateway API for meshes, and that there's also a Kubernetes, like it's part of Kubernetes SIGs. It's part of SIG networking. And so the decisions that are made here carry more weight than SMI does, obviously. And I think that's good. That's part of the reason why there's so much excitement behind it, because the users are wanting standardization. But I'm also hesitant to start codifying something like when you see a mesh resource in a .k8.io on the group, that means something. And I don't know that that's the spot for the standardization that you're looking for the specification that we're looking for. Does that make sense?
Yep. This conversation, I hope people don't feel completely the opposite. For me, has been very good. I don't think I have much more to bring to this conversation, except that I need to take this and take some time and think about this some more, and then come back with the next iteration. Personally,
same. I'm in the same boat. I've got a lot of things to think about.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of like what Keith was alluding to, of like there's a lot of innovation that is currently happening in this space where people have looked at what was tried in the past couple of years, figured out kind of like what worked well from that, what didn't work well, and are like currently exploring that like next iteration. And I don't necessarily think that we might have space right now to like build a thing that exists that supports the things that everybody else is doing for multi-cluster, right? As it stands today. I think what would be really useful is trying to like get people on the same page about assumptions and like, are there common subsets of functionality that we could express through an interface like this, and trying to identify what those might be. Because I don't think
multi-cluster is the example, but I think the
Yeah.
concept that is worth continuing to explore. Multi-cluster probably can disappear for a while. It was what was on my mind in that moment, but I think it's led to a better conversation about just operations, and I'm with you on that.
Cool.
I think I should probably point out that I am not I'm not opposed to the idea of having something that makes declarative ops simpler. I would like for it to be easier to be conformant without I would like it to be simpler to have an implementation that's conformant without doing that. You know, I'm not going to say that I think we should get rid of it entirely. Does that make sense?
Can I ask why? Just to add it, not why as in like you shouldn't think that, but just to add more flavor to that. Like, what's the damage?
There are organizations in the world that have not yet brought their operations up into the fully declarative model, and closing those organizations out from being able to use a conformant implementation bothers me. I think that is less of a concern in 2022 than it was in 2017, 2018, right? People are certainly more accustomed to the whole GitOps declarative buzzword, fully buzzword compliant thing.
Fully buzzword compliant. That's going to be my quote for you, Flynn. From
dude,
now on.
You've never heard that? That's
Flynn, fully buzzword compliant.
Love
it.
But yeah, there are, you know, you backing up to my 4-person startup thing, you know, where it would be a good thing to be able to allow people to go through and quickly spin up something, try it, do it for experiments, do it for for proofs of concept, etc., without being forced to go in and, I got to do a proof of concept. Let me hook everything into my Argo workflow first or whatever, right? You know?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
It's a very important line where it's like, in a perfect world, we would absolutely want to push people, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In a
but the world
perfect
ain't
world,
perfect.
we would absolutely be like, we want to set the standard. You need to come meet this standard. In the real world, there's a really delicate balancing act where you do a little bit of that, but you can't do too much, or else people won't adopt the new standard. They won't make it a standard. It will become defunct. So that's the balancing act we're like just on the edge of right now. We're on a knife's edge with, and I'm with you. I hear it.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's a thing.
It is a thing.
Cool. Well, I guess at that, I'm gonna try to tie off this conversation, and we have a couple minutes left. I noticed there's a handful of new folks in the call. If anybody who has not introduced themselves before wants to take a moment to introduce themselves to the group, let's do that in the last couple minutes we have before we tie this off.
Happy to go ahead. I'm Thomas Eckert. I work at HashiCorp with Mike. I met some of you at KubeCon, and it was great. I felt very welcomed, and I'm very excited to be starting in on this work, and really just in a position of learning, and excited to contribute.
Welcome.
Thank you.
David?
Welcome.
Yeah, I'm David Lenrow from Illumio, and just dropping in to understand what's going on here. We have sort of a proprietary service mesh for bare metal and virtual machines, and would like to interface with Kubernetes systems in general, and we've been looking at problems with having to do it for 15 different service mesh implementations, and would love to find out that this is the solution, and that I can help us get it right in some way.
Thanks.
I think we would love for you to find that out too.
Kevin?
Hey, yeah, so my name's Kevin. I work with Flynn and Matei at Buoyant. I'm a Linkerd maintainer. Just starting to do more work on this side of things, and probably a good idea for me to start attending these. So
I
yeah,
am
good to
definitely
meet
not going to
everyone.
be opposed to having more of the maintainers keep me honest.
Yeah,
Glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for joining up.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I guess I should introduce myself. It's my first time here. I'm Daniel from Red Hat, and we build OpenShift Service Mesh, which is basically Istio plus a few bits here and there. We do multi-tenancy is one of the things that we add. We also have our own multi-cluster thing, which is called Federation, where you have multiple trust domains, basically. Yeah, I just started working myself into Gateway API in general, and yeah, I'm here to explore how we can, well, sort of do SMI again, but better, and actually make it actually work, right? So yeah, really excited that this group is shaping up.
Happy to have you.
Yeah, cheers. Glad to see so many new people. This is already getting to be a pretty big meeting. It's good to see even more people coming in.
Yeah, this is great. I love having diverse perspectives from across different implementations, end users. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun for me at least.
Quick
find this fun.
question. Quick question as we got like 30 seconds. Is there any of the new people want to comment on this time slot? So we alternate time slots for the Gamma meetings. Does this times do you find this time slot useful? Would you prefer the one at I think 3 p.m. Pacific time? Would you be able to? We're trying to get some feedback on how the alternating time slots are helpful.
I'm in Denver, Colorado, so both time slots work pretty well.
Yeah,
for
I'm
me.
on the East Coast.
So,
Same thing.
East Coast as well. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
that'll wrap it up for today. Thanks, y'all. Been
Thank
great
you.
having y'all, and take care. Have a good rest of the day.
Cheers, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Till
Have a
next
good one.
time.
See you.